President Trump promises mass deportations for immigrants who are in the U.S. today illegally. Today, U.S. border agents were ordered to deport migrants without having any asylum hearings. Now, if mass deportations were to happen, what would that look like? KLTV7's Michael Richardson sat down with sheriffs all across East Texas who say they're ready to cooperate with the president's plans.
Deportations of illegal immigrants have been going on for decades. Now that President Trump is in office, that number may increase on a mass scale. And at the center of it, Texas, which shares the longest U.S. border with Mexico.
I believe that they will start at the top and get those that have been caught and released, that have been criminally indicted, criminally charged with major crimes.
Smith County Sheriff Larry Smith does not expect all legal immigrants to be deported, but he says he wants to prioritize deportations for those who have committed crimes.
I expect us to start receiving intelligence about those undocumented aliens that have come to or around Smith County and been charged with major crimes here or other places throughout the nation.
Gregg County Sheriff Maxie Serliano is working with Immigration and Customs Enforcement to apply for the 287G program, which allows the two entities to partner together to deport criminals.
We have always worked well with ICE. We have tried to identify with their assistance illegal aliens that are here in illegal status that have committed a crime when they're being booked into the jail.
Gregg County's role would be one part of a multi-layered strategy involved with several levels of government.
Nobody gets deported directly from here. We're just part of the process.
Sheriff Tom Selman does not expect mass deportations to occur in Angelina County.
I don't think we'll see any of that around here. I believe it'll be targeted, and local law enforcement will support those efforts. However, we're not going to spearhead them. We're not going to be going out rounding people up.
Michael Richardson, KLTV7 News.
President Trump's administration announced it will allow federal agencies to make illegal immigration detainments at schools, churches, and even hospitals.